I kind of have a vocal challenge, so I'll speak probably kind of quietly. I hope you don't mind. I want to thank first the Metropolitan. Got to meet with him earlier today, and he's so gracious and so kind. I told my wife, I texted her, they're treating me like royalty, like a saint. I said, I'm thinking of not coming back. So now I'm getting spoiled. I'm going to expect this from my community. Like, I'm going to tell my community, when I walked in and they welcomed me, they applauded. I'm expecting that every time you see me. I want to thank Bishop Daniel, who has been my primary contact for GFA, BEC, LMNOYOP. Lots of acronyms. Orthodox people like acronyms, so that's perfect. But he's so sweet and down to earth and a real lover of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. So that's a blessing. And also Dr. Father Daniel. I don't know if he's here, but you all are just great, very gracious hosts. So I appreciate that. And Stephanie, I corresponded with Stephanie. Well, I am sort of going to just talk off the cuff because Bishop Daniel changed things at the last moment. But that's good. That's a good thing. So first of all, I guess people like to hear about who's talking to them a little bit. So I am Father Michael Shanbour. I grew up in the church. I was baptized as an infant in the Orthodox Church, but without going into too much detail, my parents' generation did not have the opportunity to learn about the Orthodox faith. It was sort of a habit. It was a little bit connected with our ethnicity and so forth. There were maybe 2 books written in English about the Orthodox Church at that time, and neither one of them were that good. So I don't blame them by any means. The Orthodox Church has been under such persecution had been for so many centuries. You can kind of understand, or you can forgive your Greek Orthodox friend, for not knowing that much about the Orthodox faith after 500 years of Muslim rule, and then World War I and II, or World War II, communism, Nazism, and so forth. A lot of American Christians are very smug, forgive me, including myself, because we haven't experienced such hardship and persecution. So I grew up not really knowing anything about the church, but it just occurred to me, there's one thing that happened that made a big impression on me. And maybe it's sort of what kept me going. going to church on Sundays and so forth, we had pews. So I was sitting in the pew and I looked up at the iconostasis, the icons across the altar, and I looked at the Mother of God, and she smiled. I know that she smiled. The icons smiled at me. And icons, they don't smile. One time I asked somebody, why don't the icons, look a little friendlier? And, you get those questions. It's because they are depicted according to their heavenly reality, their heavenly bodies. When you're in the presence of God, when you're in the direct presence of Jesus Christ, you don't go. You go like this. So, at any rate, the Mother of God smiled at me, and I felt something in my heart. And then after that, I kept looking, and I was trying to get her to smile again. I crossed my eyes. It didn't work, but I know that she smiled at me. Again, I just didn't know anything about the church, really. The liturgy seemed like just a ritual that was incomprehensible, kind of, to me. Now, we had a priest who was not educated, either secular education or Orthodox education. So it's the blind leading the blind. And he was from Syria, and he had a super thick accent. And sometimes when he spoke English, it sounded like Arabic to me. So that was another obstacle. But when I was 15 years old, we had a new priest come. And he happened to be a convert. He had converted from the Southern Baptist communion. And he began to teach us. He was educated at the seminary. He began to teach us, and he especially paid attention to the young people. I was a teenager, age 15. He took us on retreats. So I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. I failed to mention that. That's you? Wichita, prettiest town I ever saw. That's wonderful. We have to talk. So, Father Anthony, he took us to Colorado on a ski retreat. So that was about a 12-hour drive on a bus. It was the greatest. I was 15. We drove all through the night. It was the coolest thing ever. At that retreat, he took us into a room in the evening. He told us the story about a man who arranged to have his friend killed and to take his wife. You know who that was? Yeah, the Holy Prophet David. So, and then he asked us to kneel and to pray. And for the first time, I realized that God was not out here, because I used to picture him as looking over my shoulder to see if I did anything wrong. And it turns out he's in here. So that was a new beginning. It wasn't anything like St. Paul's dramatic experience. It was a very quiet kind of conversion. But very powerful, and I was never the same after that. I played guitar, and I used to play guitar for our youth group. We used to sing, have a time of singing together, like a campfire. We would do country roads, and they will know you're Christians by your love. We borrowed Protestant music and different things. I continued playing guitar, and I started writing music. The first song I really wrote, it was when I was 15, and it was called In Him. In Him, the Son of God became the Son of Man, even as we are, that we might be like Him. And through His life, we have life in Him, life in the Father and the Holy Spirit. So I ended up recording that song a couple times. The second time was when I was in seminary, and I had a roommate who also played guitar and wrote kind of contemporary Christian music. And I had been working with a third gentleman prior to that. I didn't mention the big influence that church camp had on me. When I was 18 years old, I went to a place called the Antiochian Village. You guys stole the name. I went there as a counselor, so I was there for 9 weeks. 1 week of counselor training, and then 8 weeks of kids, and being in cabins with kids. The first year, the boys' cabins were like just skeletal structures with screens, and the floors were like these planks with like this much space in between, and daddy long leg spiders coming up, and you would have loved it, girls. But that camp really changed my life again, because I would say one of the most powerful things was just simply that we had church every morning and every evening. It was a rhythm. It was like a life-giving heartbeat. We had matins in the morning, or in Greek it's called Orthodox. We had vespers in the evening, and that just was the anchor for everything, and it created this bond in Christ among the counselors, who were a great group of people. Many of them are priests. Some of them are priests' wives now, today. The Antiochian Village was a big influence. And I played guitar for the campfires and sang. And I would get together with this extraordinary man who was a seminarian at the time, really gifted. I was not a speaker. I was afraid to speak in front of people, in fact. Just by the way I grew up, I was very shy and nonverbal. He was verbal. And he had a photographic memory, basically. So we started, and we really clicked. We were like one soul. I think it was St. Gregory, the theologian of Nazianzus, who says that a man and wife, husband and wife, are one flesh, but friends are one soul. We were really one soul. And I would start playing the guitar, and he would sing, and he would tell a story, the story about St. Peter and his denial, the story about St. John the Baptist. But, and he had no structure. He was completely unstructured. He was just a big, long storyline. Eventually, I started putting more structure on it. You know, verse, refrain, verse, refrain. We wrote a song called Best Friends that was, you know, they were having like a Western night that night. And so we came up, they asked us to write a song for Western night, and it became this huge hit. We are best friends. I'll take the good with the bad, because you're the best I've ever had. We are best friends. And from the start, we could see that we'd become and always be. Can you finish it? Best friends. So I gave Metropolitan Johann a CD that has a couple of the albums that we eventually did. The Gentleman at Camp, and then The Gentleman who was my roommate at seminary, who died about a year and a half ago of cancer. Father Patrick, may his memory be eternal. So I was basically, my wife used to tell people I used to be an Orthodox rock star. The music was more like folk pop, a little rock. So I can't sing hardly anymore. Over the last 30 years, I've been losing vocal prowess. It's neurological. It's what the brain is apparently telling the muscles to do and so forth. My mouth muscles are just going like this all over the place. And then recently I had a procedure. They shot my neck up with Botox. And it didn't help my voice, but my neck looks great. So I've been struggling more so recently with doing the Divine Liturgy and the other services. Thank God I have a deacon. But we'll see what happens. Metropolitan Johann thinks that I need to just write. So if I can't talk, I'll just write. Maybe that's what God has in mind. Anyway, took me a long time to get married. I married a beautiful young lady who was 12 years younger than me. In fact, since I told you about the music, the first time she saw me was at one of my concerts. She was 12 years old and I was 24. I didn't meet her at that time. Her father is an Orthodox priest in Yakima, Washington. An amazing man. He's really been like a huge mentor to me. He has been seminary after seminary. Where was I going with that? Well, it took me a long time to get married, which means I wasn't ordained because typically, I don't know how you do it here, but the church canons say that once you're ordained, you can't get married. So if you're going to get married, you have to get married first and then ordained. It's something that makes perfect sense when you begin to think about it. If you're a priest and you're like dating, like you have a woman in confession, how about after this we go out for some coffee? It's not going to work. A clergyman has to be beyond reproach, right? So that's not going to work. A clergyman has to be completely stable, solid. I got married. I married a girl who wanted to go to medical school. We went to Omaha, Nebraska for medical school. I was ordained a deacon after about a year, but there really wasn't any reason to become a priest because the church couldn't pay me. And I didn't really want to be a priest and work. I ended up working at the corporate offices for Mutual of Omaha. Some of you may have heard of that insurance corporation. She graduated the day before, she graduated from medical school and I was ordained the next day. Maybe it was 2 days. Ordained to the Holy Priesthood in 2001. So it's been 20 years. I don't know that there's anything much else I want to say about myself. I've always had curly hair, an afro. My nose gets longer every year. I love working with children. I used to work in teen ministry, but I haven't really worked with teenagers in a long time. I love to work with your 6, 7, 8, up to 12-year-olds. I do children's sermons sometimes on Sunday, and it's just a blast. The kids, the way they respond is just amazing. And the adults like my children's sermons better than the adult sermons. So it works out for everybody. Let's talk a little bit about the spiritual life of a Christian. This is the piece that I would say was most missing when I was growing up, and to some degree even during seminary, because it was very academic. In order to get accreditation, educational institutions have to jump through a lot of hoops, and they have to show how innovative they are. But if I could just say the one thing, two things, they didn't have us read the church fathers directly. They sort of interpreted them for us. Didn't work. Secondly, they didn't teach us about the spiritual life, which is obviously essential, and it's, you can't be Orthodox without it. You can do liturgy. Sometimes I warn people, don't be a Protestant after you become Orthodox. Don't be just a Protestant who likes liturgical worship or who does liturgical worship. Orthodoxy is so much more than that. So I want to refer to a model that many of the saints have given us. And it's a three-tiered, 3 stages of the Christian life. Let's put it that way. It's the 3 stages of the life of salvation. And it's purification, illumination, and deification. You can say it with me. Purification, illumination, and deification, or theosis. So, when people first learn about Orthodox deification, it's like, wow, it should only take like a week or a month, and I'll be there. Well, there's no deification on day 1. There's no deification probably on day 1000. The essence of Orthodoxy, there was a time, I think, when, especially at seminary, my mind was up in the clouds, and that didn't serve me, because Orthodoxy is super, super practical, which I was not a very practical person. I was an artist. The first stage is purification. What does that mean? Purification of what? Well, technically it's purification of the heart. Okay, so in Orthodoxy, the heart is the essence of the human person. We're not talking about the physical heart, although there is a connection with the physical heart. Do you know when they have done heart transplants, people's personalities have changed. Their tastes for foods have changed. At any rate, it's purification of the heart. The deepest place of the human person, it's the place of receptivity. I'll talk more about that. But in the spiritual literature of the church, it's often referred to as the essence of the soul. The essence of the soul. And it's related to the image of God. I'll just bring up right now, and maybe it'll come up later, but what we call the nous, N-O-U-S, which I know I wrote, is probably referred to in both books, but it's not expounded on much. This is something that really changed my understanding when I learned about the nous. The nous is the organ of spiritual receptivity. It's like our spiritual antenna. Now, we live in a digital world now, but some of you more elderly will remember when radios were like this, and you dialed and you'd hear a little hunk out of some voice, and then it would be static. Well, our nous is the indicator of our heart and our life. The nous is the spiritual antenna. It's so, the Lord said, the lamp of the body is the eye. if the eye is full of light, the body is full of light. But if the eye is full of darkness, how great is the darkness? Was the Lord worried about our physical eyesight? Was he referring to that? No. He was referring to the spiritual reality of the heart and the nous. So the nous is kind of like the mercy seat. It's the place where we can receive the revelation of God, where we speak with God and he speaks with us. If the nous is staticky, we don't get a message. We don't get anything. The saints are those whose nous has been purified. The heart is purified and the nous is clear, if you will. Like instead of having things in your eye, you can see clearly. The nous is called the eye of the soul, or it's also called the energy of the soul. Remember, the heart was called the essence of the soul. The nous is the energy of the soul. So here's what happened. Here's what happens when we're fallen and sinful. The nous is darkened. The heart becomes filled with passions. And we'll talk about passions. Because the nous, the eye of the soul, can no longer see God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Because it can no longer see God and commune with him, it starts looking for something else to commune with. And what does it find? Created things. Now, God's creation is good, but when the nous is darkened, it begins to reach out to material things as gods, as idols, as a means to happiness. So, sex, drugs, rock and roll, money, pride, pride in our abilities and intellect and any number of things. So one of the saints, St. John of the Ladder, who wrote an amazing book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent, he said, the darkened nous is like a dog in a butcher shop. It just goes after, like it's ecstatically doesn't have any attention. The nous is kind of our spiritual attention. The goal is to have the nous resting in the heart, which is its natural place, so that it can see God in a purified heart. Okay, I'm maybe getting a little more technical than I wanted to. So when Adam and Eve fell and sinned, their spiritual eyes were darkened. They lost the robe of God's uncreated light. That's why they knew they were naked. Because they weren't naked before. They were clothed with the divine light. Nobody knows that. Well, some of you are nodding. I mean, like people that are Christians and they read the Bible and they don't know that, which it's not directly in the scriptures, so I'm not saying they're bad, but this is what the church fathers tell us, and it makes immediate sense. Those people that, well, you probably don't know any people who are nudists. They justify the nudity because it's the natural state. It's how God made us. It's okay, but see, once you know that we were made to be clothed in divine light, then you say, no, it's not. No, it isn't the natural state. It's an unnatural state. So the Adam and Eve's noose was darkened. They no longer had that just natural communion with God. They no longer were communing with him and hearing his voice and so forth. That's when the fathers say the passions rushed in, so to speak. Now, what are the passions? The passions are misdirected energies. So the best way to think about the passions is not that they are completely unnatural to us, but rather they're misdirected energies. They're energies that used to be directed toward God and therefore created a stability and harmony in the human person. But instead now they're misdirected and they become anger, lust, envy, despair, pride, greed, right? They're misdirected energies. Like greed is actually the desire to be rich spiritually in Christ. That's the original intention. The fathers say that there is a holy anger. There was an anger that God created in us. We may mention that a little bit later, but the anger that is supposed to be turned toward evil, it's what Eve was supposed to do. When the serpent came to her, she was supposed to say, "No, I won't listen to you." She was supposed to have that pushback. That's different than anger at Adam. Wives, remember that. Just kidding. So the passions, they're just distorted energies of the human, natural enemies of the human soul that have become distorted because we've become spiritually blinded, so to speak. Now, so the passions are sort of, I could say, friends who have become enemies. They really are foreign to us. So a lot of people will say, well, yeah, I lusted after that woman, but I'm only human. Well, that's not human. That's inhuman. And this is, I could just editorialize. This is kind of a big difference, generally speaking, in the East from the West about human nature. Because in the West, human nature is the bad guy. It's fallen. It can do no good. And so the natural state of man is sin, according to many Western theologies. But according to the Orthodox teaching, the natural state of man is not sin, is communion with God. And I write something about that in Know the Faith, in that book, Know the Faith. Okay, so these passions have become our enemies. This is what we need to purify the heart of. And it's a very practical thing. The fathers say the spiritual life begins with, in Greek, praxis. What do you think that means? Practice. Very good. Practice. Practice being humble. Practice being content. Practice being thankful. They say that the first stage of the Christian life is fulfilling the commandments. Not in a legal following the law, but I'm talking about the law of Christ, the law of love, the commandments of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because by doing that and living according to what is natural, because God didn't give us commandments that are like big burdens and, unnatural to us. And no, that's the natural state. By doing that, the passions are weakened. They're weakened and they just die because we don't feed them. What happens when you feed a lion? It's satisfied briefly, but then it wants more. That's like the passions. When we feed the passions, they grow. There's even there's a condition that the fathers talk about called prepossession. What it means is that we have done the same sin over and over and over again so many times that now it's almost like Pavlov's dogs. You ring the bell, boom, you're already in the sin. Then I told Bishop Daniel I could speak about the stages of temptation, but we don't really have time for that. But I will tell you a story, because some of you are falling asleep. This relates to the passions. So there was a monk who had the passion of feeling offended, the passion of anger, terrible passion of anger. And it seemed like God would send people to insult him in one way or the other, constantly. And he'd get so mad. And so he kept confessing this, and finally the abbot, his spiritual father, said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Every time somebody offends you and you get angry, I want you to give them a coin. Monks usually don't have coins, so maybe he gave him a pocket full of coins. So he goes out. Next thing you know, somebody says the wrong thing, like your cassock's crooked, and he's angry, and then he remembers, so he says, did I say that not only he has to give them a coin, but he has to say thank you when he gives them the coin. So he reaches in the pocket and he's just like boiling, and he's like, thank you. And this went on and on for a while. And at some point, after months, his spiritual father said, okay, you're done. I think you're healed. So the monk gets sent on an errand to go into the city and buy something. So he's going into the city. He goes through the city gates, and there's always some guy, sitting at the city gate, and he yells something at the monk, you're dirty, you're whatever you are, you're a hypocrite, blah, blah. And the monk just starts laughing from his gut, bent over. And the man's like, why are you laughing? And the monk said, I used to have to pay for that. So But you see how the passions are overcome. Every passion has a means of healing. And a general rule that you can take with you today is that if you want to get rid of a passion, practice the opposite virtue. If you get angry a lot, practice kindness. If you're discontent and, complaining and grumbling, practice gratitude to God, and so forth. That's one way of explaining how to get rid of, to weaken and redirect these passions, all the passions. I forgot what I was going to say regarding the passions. So, maybe it'll come back, but how do we measure our spiritual level? Now, first of all, we shouldn't be preoccupied with our spiritual growth. People come sometimes to me and say, I'm just going backwards and I'm not. And I just say, you know what, you're not the best judge of that. We don't want to judge ourselves quite like that. That doesn't mean we don't confess sin, we don't acknowledge sin and so forth. But we measure, and I heard this from the spiritual son of Saint Sophrony of Essex, England. Saint Sophrony was a monk on Mount Athos, and his spiritual father was Saint Silouan the Athonite. You have to read about him. He was, there's not enough time to tell, but he was like a Russian peasant of the 18th, 19th centuries. So you have Saint Sophrony, Saint Silouan, Saint Sophrony, and the man that I've heard speak on several occasions, who's an incredible saintly man himself. His name is Father Zachariah, and he's in Essex, England. He's a father confessor there at the monastery. He said, you measure your spiritual level not by how many times you pray a day necessarily, how many services you go through a week. He said, you measure it by how you react when someone offends you, when someone snubs you. That's when you know. Why? Because then you know, I've got this passion. And that means I got a lot of work to do. So there's a story in the Desert Fathers. You aware of the Desert Fathers? The monk comes to his spiritual father, and I forget the beginning of the story, he's kind of wondering how he should deal with different things. And the spiritual father sends him to the cemetery. And he says, I want you to go to this grave, and I want you to praise that person. Just say, you were such a holy, wonderful person, so saintly, so pure, angelic. You were so talented and gifted. And then come back to me. So he goes and he praises the person who was buried. He comes back. The spiritual father says, how did he respond? And The monk says, didn't say anything, was just did nothing. And then he says, okay, I want you to go back to that same grave, and I want you to rebuke that person and tell them they were the scum of the earth and the biggest sinners, and they were, offensive and unholy. And so the monk goes and he does it. He comes back. The spiritual father says, how did he respond this time? The monk says, nothing. And the spiritual father says, that's how we should receive praise or criticism. We should receive criticism as if it's praise, and we should receive praise as if it's criticism. Steady. So the only person that can do that is somebody who's dispassionate. That word in the Orthodox language doesn't mean, I don't care about anything. Doesn't mean that. It means someone who has true freedom. They respond not according to something they're reacting to. They respond from love. Because only the person who has overcome the passions has the freedom, the complete freedom to respond as opposed to react. I keep forgetting things. I had more on responding. Oh, St. John of Damascus mentions in he has kind of a book of summarizing the whole theology of the church, and he's talking about Christ, and he says, in Jesus, in Christ, there was no compulsion. Jesus never did anything out of compulsion, because if you're compelled, it's not freedom. Some people are compelled by guilt. All right, I'll help you move next week because I feel guilty if I don't, So the only free person is the person where the passions are not activated anymore. And that's rare. That's just the stage of purification, right? But in order to receive illumination, you have to get purified. Now, these stages, they're not like these perfect boxes. We can certainly receive illumination to degrees, even if we still mire in the passions somewhat, even if we're still addicted to the passions. But it won't be a permanent state. It won't be a permanent state. And then deification I can't even talk about because I have no idea what that's like. I can talk about it in relation to telling you about some saints that I'd like to mention just a little bit. But first I want to say, in Orthodoxy, what's the greatest virtue? What is the thing that will save us faster than anything else? Humility. Humility. And to be Orthodox is to, first and foremost, not be like me, but be humble. To practice humility, to learn humility. It's more important than anything, spiritual gifts, being a great missionary, like being a great speaker, humility. The church will teach you humility one way or the other. God will. I had a deacon in Spokane, Deacon Elijah. He came from a charismatic Protestant background, Pentecostal really. He was Dwayne before he was Deacon Elijah. And he told me the first time he went into the Orthodox church building with all the iconography and so forth, I guess the first time he was maybe more just a little off kilter. The second time he went in, he had this wonderful, awful feeling. And it was telling him, if you stay here, if you continue coming here, your ego will be crushed. How many of us would stay? To his credit, he stayed. But that's, I think, the reality. And that's what the spiritual life is supposed to do to us. It's supposed to crush our ego. And when it does, after it does, a while after it does, we'll be so happy. When it's happening, we may not be as happy. That comes with a lot of suffering too, that the Lord bestows on us. Many trials, many crosses. So it's painful. Jesus experienced pain on the cross. He experienced more pain than we could imagine or that we will ever collectively experience, because it wasn't just physical pain, it was the pain of being God and being killed by your own creatures and being rejected. And of course, the other part of having the sins of all the world on your shoulders. And so I know that it's maybe been close to an hour. Can I mention a few saints? Okay. If, in my opinion, if you want to become Orthodox, read the lives of the saints. And I kind of feel like the contemporary saints sometimes are more relatable. And sometimes we have more information, detailed information. They used tape recorders, literally, to hear what these saints were saying and so forth. So there's really a multitude. The 20th century produced quite a crop of Orthodox saints, and they're not all canonized yet by any means. But is anybody familiar with Saint Porphyrios? Saint Porphyrios of Kavsokalivia. Can hardly say that. There's a book called Wounded by Love that it's a must. You must have it. The first part is he tells his life story in his own words, collected by different people, but it just reads as kind of a story. The second part are teachings, sayings, things, what he taught and so forth. Every saint is like this new revelation, but it's not new. It's the same revelation, kind of just incarnate in a different way, with different words sometimes and so forth. It's kind of like, and with the modern saints, sometimes it's more relatable because, for instance, I'm going to go back to Saint Porphyrios, but what about Saint Paisios of Mount Athos? Anybody? You have to get to know him. He's one of the most popular saints in all of Orthodox history. a Greek saint. He died in 1994. So we're talking recent. St. Porphyrius died in 1991. But he talks about temptation. He talks about thoughts. You want to read him when he talks about thoughts. He says, thoughts are like airplanes. Your heart is the airport, the airstrip. When the planes are coming and they're making noise and they're saying, permission to land, sir, permission. We don't give them permission to land. Just analogies like that, teaching like that. It helps us to understand. Just in general, in regard to thoughts, we should be suspicious of our thoughts. We should not accept all of our thoughts. The devil sends us a lot of thoughts. And a lot of times he'll send us what we call intrusive thoughts. Have you ever gotten just hit with a where did that come from? But a lot of people start saying, oh my gosh, I guess I'm like that. Or I'll give you an example. Forgive me, but a young man might have a thought, oh, I'm kind of attracted. I find that boy attractive. I must be a homosexual. I guess I should just go that direction. See how it works. That's kind of not a very subtle example, but okay. St. Porphyrios, wounded by love. I'm telling you this because these men and women were deified. They lived in a permanent state of heavenly communion with God, which oftentimes bestows incredible spiritual gifts. Saint Seraphim of Sarav, he had a pet. He had a wild bear for a pet, and he used to feed him. And then he named him Sasha. I guess that's a girl. Is it Sasha? No, I forgot. I think it's a boy in Russian. And then he would tell the bear what to do, and the bear would do it. Well, that's like Adam and Eve, right? That's who were in the state of illumination. Adam and Eve were created. St. Porphyrios had incredible spiritual gifts. He could see things with his spiritual eyes. Once there was a Roman Catholic monk that came to him. Before the monk opened his mouth, he called him by name, and he began to tell him, to describe to him in detail what his monastery looked like, the buildings, where things were, the different monks that were there. If that Roman Catholic monk didn't become Orthodox after that, I don't know. Must be, not going to say that. I don't know what happened to him, but St. Porphyrios could tell where people should dig wells to find water. He called it a spiritual television. And he was clairvoyant, somebody in America had cancer. Someone that he knew, but they were in America, he was in Greece. He called them on the phone. He said, you have cancer. Tell the doctor that it's on the lower left side of your liver, a tumor. Crazy, right? There's books full of that stuff, and just full of that stuff. And these are not spiritual gifts to show off or something. They're always for the benefit, just like the Lord's miracles are always for the salvation of a person's soul. They don't flaunt these things. They often don't even admit them. And if somebody, like a man walked into the altar, he was an altar server, but the divine liturgy was over. He had forgotten something. He walks into the altar. He sees St. John Maximovich of Shanghai and San Francisco. Have you heard of him? Died in 1966. Amazing. He slept 1 hour a night. The other part of the night he prayed, and he prayed for his orphans, because he had orphans that lived with him. But the altar server walked into the altar, and St. John is lifted up off the ground, surrounded in light, praying. And a saint will typically say, don't tell anybody what you saw until after I died, because of humility, Couple more quick stories. St. Paisios. So there were 3 young men that were coming to visit him. One of them was producing pornographic movies. So he joyfully invites them in. He sits them down. He gives them the usual hospitality that they do on Mount Athos. They give you maybe a little cup of Turkish coffee, and they give you a Turkish delight. And St. Paisios was passing them out. He was handing a tray. He was letting them take off the tray. When he got to the 3rd guy, he accidentally dropped the Turkish delight. Well, in his hut, it was a dirt floor. So he takes the Turkish delight and he rolls it around in the dirt. And they're sticky. He rolls it around, he puts it on the tray, and he offers it to the young man. Now remember, he's never met this man before. And the boy was like, "Elder, why are you treating me like this? What are you trying to do?" Or something like that. And Elder Paisios, because he said, why are you giving me filth? And Elder Paisios said, St. Paisios said, why are you giving to other people such filth? Why are you having them taste of such filth? And it changed his life. The saints, they always found a way to, if they needed to rebuke someone, typically a way that would not destroy the person and bring them to despair or judge them. One more story. Saint Iakovos, can't remember, well, he was from Greece, but this is an interesting story. So there were 3 young ladies who came to visit him. The 2 young ladies were worried about their friend. She had started living a lesbian lifestyle. So they brought her to St. Iakovos, just hoping, there could be some spiritual revelation. So St. Iakovos, I'm trying to remember one detail. Oh, I can't remember the detail. But he said to her, maybe, okay, I got it, sorry. She told him she was a lesbian. And he said, "A lesbian? I love lesbians. I love them." Now, Lesbos is an island in Greece. A lesbian is someone who comes from Lesbos. And so he joyfully, embraced her, and he said, "Come, let's have confession. Let's talk. He takes her into another room. She confesses everything, and she comes out changed. So it's an example of how he didn't embarrass her. He found a way to somehow misunderstand her and embrace her, but find a way for her to repent. So I don't know if we have any time for questions, but I just want to drive it home that I think you should read these saints. There's a book called Father Arseny, too, about a holy priest who lived for a long time in a concentration camp in Soviet Russia. Amazing eyewitness accounts, very short little chapters of eyewitness accounts. His real name wasn't Father Arseny, but there's so many men and women who were put into communist camps in Romania. And I got to spend time with one of those men who's now reposed in the Lord, Father Roman Braga. And he was put into this Pitești prison where they did the worst kinds of inhuman experimental tactics. Humiliating. They tried to beat any God and virtue and family. They wanted to completely change their personalities, so to speak. But Father Roman was just filled with joy all the time. And he was asked, do you blame the people that, persecuted you and stuff? And he was like, oh, no, why? We love them. In a book that somebody wrote, he's quoted as saying, they could take everything from me except for my love for them. Amazing, huh? Oh, there's one more. Mother Gavrilia, The Ascetic of Love. This book is out of print, unfortunately. Somebody borrowed it out of my library and I never saw it again. It's a big, thick book. Mother Gavrilia, you'll be interested in this because while she ministered on like 5 or 6 different continents, she spent a good deal of her time in India. And she was a lay person to begin with, not a nun. She later became a nun. She had learned some kind of foot, maybe pressure point type of massage, and she would be asked to do that to help people. But people would be healed through her prayers. One time a Protestant pastor came to her in India, and they knew each other, but he said to her, "You're not a good missionary. You're a horrible missionary." She said, "Why?" "Well, because you don't know the languages. You don't know the dialects." And she thought for a second, she prayed to God silently, and he gave her this. She said, "I know 5 languages." He said, "Oh, really? What?" She said, "Smile, touch, love," and I can't remember the last 2. But she lived to be in her 90s. She had become a nun, and she had a group of nuns. She had cancer. She had a big cancerous, what do you call it? Tumor, thank you. Like around here, in her 90s. But when she received Holy Communion on Pascha, Easter, it disappeared. Anyway, I could go on and on. Does anybody have any questions? By the way, I can send a reading list, a recommended reading list that I have. And certainly I can, it's pretty long, but I could make sure I give you the first priority books. And I mentioned it to the Metropolitan. He wanted to see it.